Maybe we can wait for another 2-3 minutes before we start.
That's very bad, Gladys.
Joysa mentioned that now she's joining.
So Dr. Ruby Pavankar has also joined.
Joysa mentioned she will connect in 15 minutes. Maybe we can start first, if it's possible.
Okay. Oh yeah,
Okay.
sure. Then we can start the proceedings,
Yeah.
so
Okay.
that we can have more time for discussion at the end. So welcome everyone to this session. As you know, this is the final in the series of seminars that we have been organizing as part of the Task Force 3, T20 Think 20 Task Force 3 on life, resilience, and values for well-being, which is very much aligned to one of the priorities of the Indian G20 presidency. So it is my great honor to welcome all of you on behalf of Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, the task force lead co-chair, and then of course RIS, and also the task force 3 itself, of which I am co-chair myself, Dr. Sabyasachi Saha from RIS. So as you know, just for collective recall, we in this task force, we are really working on three parameters, as we can see. First is, of course, life, which is lifestyle for environment and promoting sustainable consumption. And within that, we have had discussions on SCP framework, circular economy, green transitions, integrated development, and going beyond GDP, the new measurement frameworks. And we have also discussed issues of rural-urban linkages. The second broad set of issues that our co-chairs have been working on is about building integrity and ethics as part of international relations, as part of science, technology, innovations, and of course, financing itself. And finally, we have a very distinguished group of co-chairs who are contributing to this very idea of sustainable finance and financing resilient infrastructure, and for sustainable urbanization, integrated development, infrastructure, etc. So how do we have urbanization with low carbon footprint, and what would be the trajectory for future cities and habitat, about mobilizing capital and capacity, and of course building resilient infrastructure with focus on countries in special situations and the LDCs. We are definitely reminded of at RIS of a good partnership that we had back in 2018 with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Ministry of Finance in India, where we were looking at various aspects of infrastructure financing, and we really had very, very important high-level dialogues organized across the country, which gave us a lot of insights as to how the revenue models, the inclusivity, and etc., and the financing that would come in for infrastructure, particularly in countries like India and other developing countries, and how multilateral development banks could be useful in that regard. So without further ado, the other point is that today is the sixth seminar in the series. Just if we see how much we have covered and how far we have come, right from 24th March when we had our first seminar, which discussed well-being measurement approaches and recalibrating international institutions. Then we have had the second seminar, which was about sustainable consumption and production, climate crisis, and One Health. Then we had our third seminar on infusing ethics and values in international relations. The fourth seminar was on mainstreaming community partnership and traditional approaches for life. The fifth one was about urban-rural linkages for a new development model. And today, for the final session, we have financing for sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure. Now we have a brilliant lineup of speakers, co-chairs, and which will be followed by comments from other co-chairs and also discussion with everyone who have joined us online from various parts of the world. Thank you for that. Without further ado, I would now hand over the floor to Mr. Nicholas Bushu, who is going to kind of chair and moderate this session and also share his ideas given his strong expertise and background in this area. Mr. Nicholas Bushu is co-founder and president of the Grand Paris Alliance for Metropolitan Development in France. And Mr. Bushu is also member of the T20 process, has been part of the T20 process, leading it at various levels in the last couple of years. And he's also advising over a dozen of academic, civic, and CSR initiatives on urban and global transitions, among them the Trans-Siberian Scientific Way in Siberia or the World Conference on Creative Economy successfully launched in Indonesia. So with this, I hand over the floor to you, Nicola, for taking forward the conversation today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sabiasachi, and welcome everyone in India time or in other time zones. Thank you very much for our distinguished colleagues and speakers, Gladys Lecchini in Rosario in Argentina, Professor Danong, who is usually in Jakarta, but now is in Boston. So it's 6:30 a.m. in Argentina. It's 5:30 a.m. in Boston. We have also our dear colleague from Fundación Getúlio Vargas in Brazil, who should be joining us very soon, Joyza Dutra, and last but not least, Anita Prakash with Area, who happens to be in India at the present moment, so no time difference. I mention this because sometimes we tend to forget that we are really working across very, very different time zones. And the intensity of the discussions that are being held this year in the context of the G20 India, and especially in the context of the T20 and our task force, we sometimes forget that we are not at the same place, right? But however, we have to deal with those we have to deal with a number of common issues. When I was looking at the seminar of today, I was thinking that we could have practically done it also in conjunction with the discussion that took place last week about this question of urban-rural connections and connectivity, because this is indeed one very important aspect that has been neglected largely by infrastructure investment discussions over the past let's say, over the past decade. But we can see that this is an important topic in India, obviously, but also in South Asia and in a number of regions in the world, in lower income and middle income countries, but also in countries like France or a number of countries in the EU or in the US, where the urban-rural continuum has completely disappeared, and other parameters or paradigms such as metropolitan development have taken over, but with not enough consideration of a number of negative spillovers of such aspects. So today we are dealing with the issue of financing resilient infrastructure. This is, as you said, the last of this online seminars of the task force. Next week we will have the intermediate T20 summit online and physically in Mumbai, including one meeting of our task force. So that will be an occasion to check exactly where we are, also in consideration of the policy briefs that have been submitted to the task force. And what will come next is the preparation of the T20 communique and the final summit of the T20 in general, including our task force, which will be August 1st and 2nd, right, in Mysuru. So we are about the last mile of this year's conversations, and my impression, I will not attempt at all to summarize the past seminars, but my impression, I was a bit, to be honest, a bit dubious at the beginning about including the issue of values and ethics in our discussions, because I had no idea how it could fit. But then, step by step, discussions after discussions, seminars after seminars, I have been gradually more convinced about precisely the value of including the angle of value and ethics in the overall discussion about infrastructure investment and resilience. As you know probably, and surely the speakers of today, they know it, and the co-chairs of the task force who have joined us must know it, and probably a number of the attendees. But let me just very briefly say that in the past years, since 2015, so practically over a decade, the issue of infrastructure investments has more or less always been there on the table of the T20. But it's only since the G20 Argentina in 2018 that the infrastructure investment as a distinguished task force, as a distinct task force, has been there. Infrastructure investments and financing with different kind of nuance, but in 2018 Argentina, 19 Japan, then 20 Saudi Arabia, 21 Italy, 22 Indonesia, and this year within this broad task force 3 with the T20 India. And now that the discussions about the organization of and the priorities of the G20 in Brazil have started, it is obvious that the issue of infrastructure finance will not disappear, even if we don't know exactly what will be the status of that particular topic. In the last 5 to 6 years, the T20 has contributed more or less directly to a number of innovations and interesting breakthrough regarding infrastructure investments. I am thinking about a few things. During the G20 of Argentina, there was an emphasis on regional development, which included somehow issues of urban development, and this was rather new in the context of the G20, where the issues of urban development and urban investments have always lay very low and have always been considered as very, very secondary secondary for macroeconomic issues, secondary for geopolitical issues, secondary for as compared with other topics, which I think is a mistake, but it has been like this. In 2019, the Japanese G20 has promoted the issue of quality infrastructure investments, and the T20, and especially the task force on infrastructure, has been instrumental in promoting that aspect of quality infrastructure investments at the global level. This was not just initiated during the G20 Japan. This was there on the table a few years already in the years before, so it was something well prepared. But the T20 allowed for a very cross-sectoral approach that, for me, echoes a little bit what we are doing this year with the Task Force 3, in the sense that the quality infrastructure investment approach included very specifically environmental, climate, biodiversity perspectives, also through the new doctrine of spillovers that at that time ADBI, who was the lead chair of the task force and the lead chair of the T20, was also pushing the spillover effects of infrastructure investments, including at an urban level, including a number of social and economic parameters, which sometimes in the past have also been a bit neglected, just in favor of overall international global mechanisms of pushing for more infrastructure and more infrastructure for more growth, but a little bit unilaterally and a little bit without sufficient consideration of the value of including more in detail social economic parameters and especially demand issues and not just supply approaches of infrastructure investments. During the G20 of Saudi Arabia, things were obviously a bit different for two reasons. First, of course, the outbreak of the COVID has disrupted profoundly existing plans and agenda. But second, in that disrupted context, the G20 Saudi presidency had two major priorities regarding infrastructure investments. One was so-called infratech, and Saudi Arabia is still pushing that infratech agenda through the G20, meaning more technological input in infrastructure systems, including for resilient infrastructure systems, including for maintenance of existing infrastructure. And the other point was linked with the low carbon emissions, but through the specific lens of the circular carbon economy that has also been promoted by Saudi Arabia. We tried to push for the urban agenda to be part, which was not rebuked, but still this was not center. In Italy, and we are coming to 23, but in Italy in 21, I think a number of innovations were introduced. First, and this was largely continued under the leadership of Professor Danang for the T20 and infrastructure and the Indonesian colleagues as in general last year. That is, first, the T20 is a very nice and good platform, but we need to talk with other engagement groups, especially the business group, the B20, which is very strong and which in the past years has always taken a lot of care regarding how to deal with the issue of infrastructure investments, how to engage the private sector into infrastructure investments at all scales, including at the local level, and has been a strong advocate also with the G20 leaders. Another group that was included in the conversation, kind of troika with the T20, is a club more informal than our T20 called G20, the Club of Long-Term Investors, that is in the G20, the Club of Sovereign Wealth Funds, to simplify. And the discussions has been going on with those organizations very intensely under the T20, G20 Italy. Last year, we managed even to get a little bit further by organizing seminars with the Ministry of Finance of Indonesia at high level, and systematically in February, in May, and in November with the other engagement groups to highlight the different angles. That is to simplify in the T20 level, sort of a broad approach, a broad and integrated and holistic approach of infrastructure investments, with the B20 solidly I would say, an approach rooted in business, but also with the worldwide consideration of hurdles and opportunities, and with the D20 Long-Term Investors Club, a sort of vision from sovereign wealth funds about the issue. And probably this the only way to structure at the G20 level more solid responses to support infrastructure investments that are much more inclusive, much more demand driven, and which do not nurture only a unilateral approach to sort of growth, but also take into account much more subtlety, the issues of biodiversity conservation and preservation, or even biodiversity positive, and other agendas such as the climate agenda is something that depends on not just the T20 but several engagement groups, and the quality of the discussions also with the finance track in the context of the G20. So this legacy from last year from the G20 Indonesia has also allowed us, I think, Professor Danang was heavily promoting or intensely promoting new tools in the G20, such as the establishment of a global fund for sustainable urban development. That is with an ideas that we need probably to rethink a little bit what it means acting at a local level, and how to avoid that global issues or unregulated global issues, such as globalized markets, for example, would overshadow the capacities of public stakeholders to make not only good plans, but also to implement strong policies, strong sustainable development policies. So where are we this year? And I will finish with this. Where are we this year with the G20 India? I must say that at this moment, the level of interaction between the T20, our task force, and the finance track, if I compare with last year, is not that advanced. And this also that in the context of the finance track of the G20 and of the infrastructure working group in particular, a lot of emphasis has been laid by the G20 presidency of India about precisely urban development. And it was very good news for me for looking at the agenda of the first meeting of the infrastructure working group, which is under the finance track, and even the second meeting later in March. The issue of urban development has been put on the table as one very, very important issue for infrastructure investments globally. And that was, I would say, investigated alongside with a number of multilateral financial institutions, multilateral development banks in particular, with the Asian Development Bank in particular, bringing special support through expertise provided to the infrastructure working group. The other point, if I look at the inter-engagement group level of discussion that was initiated largely during, for infrastructure during the G20 Italy 2 years ago, and then further emphasized during the G20 Indonesia last year. I would say we are not there yet. Also, we are a little bit behind, probably. Last year, at that time of the year, the discussions were already quite intense, and the T20 under the chairmanship of Professor Danang was already preparing a last seminar late in the autumn at the occasion of the fall meeting of the IMF and World Bank with the Minister of Finance of Indonesia, etc., and the support at that time of Deloitte of a 2-day seminar connecting the dots between the overall global G20 wide infrastructure investment agenda, Indonesia, ASEAN, regional, and with multiple perspectives on urban development, environmental transformations, etc. So I think the reason why I'm mentioning those is not to say that we are not doing good job with the T20 this year. I would say on the contrary. And for instance, the approach through ethics and values, I think, is something very, very strong. But I would say we are in the very beginning of May. We have the intermediate T20 summit next week, and our summit in May, June, July, in 3 months. I would call upon us as the T20 Task Force 3 to make the best use of the next 3 months, to share our conclusions with others, and to check with the other engagement groups, especially the B20, what common expression we could have to highlight or defend together most pressing issues and the implementation of new solutions that could come out of the task force, of the numerous policy briefs that have been submitted. But also, and this is my last point, with a little bit of background and experience, I think the T20 can be a very solid anchor for cross-sectoral discussions, but also to mobilize partners in different engagement groups, and also to have a strong expression at the G20 level. So maybe we should plan for the T20 summit in Mumbai to set up a special event about infrastructure together with the infrastructure working group and different number of counterparts to make sure that our recommendations, they are widely shared, but our way to look at infrastructure investments from a holistic standpoint is also being shared. Because if you look at the conclusions of the first 2 meetings of the infrastructure working group, it's a lot about very technical issues, etc. But the values and ethics about why to invest in infrastructure investments, how to do that, with whom, and for the benefit of whom, right, is something that is a bit absent from the discussions of the infrastructure working group, but which is fully here in our T20 discussion. So I will stop here with those first series of insights and remarks. We have about an hour now to enter into the discussions with the colleagues and co-chairs who have joined us. And at some point, what I suggest is that let's take about 20 minutes to 30 minutes, right, for a series of not presentations, but insights from the colleagues, and then take the time for a thorough discussion with the other co-chairs who are not speakers today and the attendees to the present discussion. Thank you very much. So with this, who would like to start? Maybe Professor Danang?
Nicholas, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks so far, Nicholas, and I think you have covered most of the substance of my speech actually. But I think it's you have given me of given all of us the nice introductions and the history and continuations from one G20 to another, highlighting the importance of infrastructures in the whole development conversations. Thanks for the organizer also to invite me to speak on the subjects of my interest. Nicholas, I think when you talk about the importance of infrastructure as a separate policy agenda, I think what we recall is the in 2019 in Japan, where they have expressed very specific about the quality of infrastructures. But today, I think the challenge is not just about quality, the challenge is how to give impetus to a new kind of infrastructure that really connect the development needs of the global south. Um, you also mentioned that there are several seminars before this seminar that also give the nice background actually, and I was happy that our session is going to be as the last session of the whole seminar series, which really put everything that has been discussed in the 5 earlier seminars and on implementations. I happened to join several of the earlier seminars, and they give a nice foundation and background on how we actually put and allocate our investment and how to.
Uh, Hello, everyone. Can you please put your mic on mute? There is a background noise.
Continue?
Yeah, you may continue.
Good. Sorry. Okay. So I think when you look at the five going back 4 or 5 years ago, I think we should look at the what happened since then. What happened since Argentina? What happened since Japan? I think when we look at that, there's nothing much happened in terms of the change of the policy, except perhaps in the last 3 years, the um, the introductions of the digital infrastructures has been put as an eminent result of the pandemic COVID. But still, when you look at the numbers and you look at the statistics, not much has been a new approach has been made within the G20, G7 spheres. So uh, uh, allow me to talk about numbers a little bit. I think when you look at the global estimates, we will be talking about 3.7 to 5.5 trillion US dollars annually to meet the demand for another 3.3 to 0.5% of GDP of the current 3% average global GDP. I know that in another discussion within the T20, there's the call for another metrics uh, beside the GDP, but at this moment, allow me to use the GDP as a proxy for measuring the economic progress of different countries. Um, those figures that I mentioned earlier, 3.7, 5.5 trillion US dollars, is the difference depends on whether we include housing and real estate as the investment demand. But those number has not covered the investments like related to climate projects, projects also to achieve the SDG. Jeffrey Sachs last year warned us that we will not be able to meet the target by SDG by only allocating 0.3 to 0.5% of GDP, which is probably a modest estimate of what you need actually. And also last year it was mentioned very clearly that those number has not covered the funds required for reconstruction of infrastructures due to the geopolitical conflicts. So we will be talking about the very big numbers, gigantic numbers that has not been really put um, on the table by different countries. And Nicholas, you mentioned about collaboration. It's been we need some much more collaboration efforts than what we see today. Um, so when we look at my university, when we look at the numbers, we will be reaching easily on the size of investments between 6 to 8 trillion annual investment to meet the global demand, not only for developing countries, we see for the developed countries as well. So when you look at Australia, China, and Japan, statistically, we have invested sufficiently to exceed their forecast infrastructure requirements. But we see other countries, even in the developed countries like UK and United States and Germany, they still have a gaps of investment. So I'm at the US at the moment, working closely with Harvard Kennedy School on looking at the future infrastructure policies globally, and we see that there are numbers of infrastructure demands is also increased in not only in developing countries but also in developed countries. But I think the majority of the investments will come, the demands come from developing countries and global south like Brazil, Indonesia, and Mexico from now until 2040. And we look at sectors, you'll be still talking about electricity and roads are two most important sectors. Together, they account more than two-thirds of the global investment needs. Um, uh, when you look at other particular examples related with the gap in finance, is the financing the sub national governments. And I am happy to listen to the seminars of rural and urban linkage last week, where we have also an eminent demand for addressing the financing of the subnational governments. Most of the discussion on the global collaboration are mostly on the on national level and not giving much attention and for the urban regional projects, subnational projects, city level projects. We know that cities are hubs for economic social activities. Cities are homes for more than 60% of the world population, of which more than 50% are young generations. And at the same time, when you look at the statistics, cities are prone to adverse impacts of economic progress. With the increasing average income in the city's population, the consumptions of goods and services is compensated by increasing scale of solid and liquid waste, pollution and carbon emission that cannot be managed by city authorities. Especially for those cities located in the coastal areas, they are very prone to the impact of climate change. For example, the rise of seawater levels. Others are impacted by food and consumption of supply with the rise of energy prices. So the need for cleaner energies, telecommunication, transport services, water supply and sanitation, as well as proper homes for city inhabitants cannot be provided with the capacity of city governments and city dwellers. And this condition is especially inevitable for cities in the global south. So our current framework, if you look at the existing frameworks provided by the G20 members and even the G7, they are um, not sufficient to meet those growing demands for infrastructure services. Bilateral and multilateral development bank assisted projects for urban slum improvement and cities regeneration have shown a mixed result. So I think when you look at those facts and those arguments, I believe that the G20 India will be appropriate venue for T20 continue effort to achieve what was discussed during the T20 India on the implementation of a sustainable infrastructure investment and financing framework as a real world example, and to establish a global investment platform for sustainable urban infrastructure implemented in the round of G20 presidencies, not only during India, but Brazil and also later South Africa. Which what Nicholas mentioned earlier, the multilateral development banks and or the long-term investors like sovereign wealth funds can further take this initiative forward. So we are very hopeful. I'm particularly very hopeful that this can be having a concrete example in this G20. So our global financial support to bilateral and multilateral grants and loans has been channeled in a limited scale. Long-term private investors and lenders are less interested in financing local level projects due to the project risk and lack of confidence in the underlying authorities. So last year we were talking extensively, vastly on the project de-risking as the current challenge and the infrastructure project when attracting and mobilizing global financial resources. This is even more apparent in subnational and city level projects. So I will be finishing my speech on saying that it is therefore important and timely that T20 India is voicing out the need for G20 leaders not only to make a statement and agree on the policy agenda, but start to act establishing platforms, these global platforms, making sure that global financial resources channeled properly and equitably. Last year in Indonesia, we have expressed the need to implement the concept of sustainable infrastructure investment and financing, the abbreviation is SIAF, through the establishment of a global platform. So I believe it is now important to start discussing the framework and the implementation modalities. So my suggestion is that the G20 can launch it during the G20 in South Africa 2 years from now in 2025, or even better that we'll be able to push the ideas of having these platforms in 2024 in G20 Brazil. So I will stop here, Nicholas, and we'll be happy to listen to other panelists and having a discussion later on. So thank you so much. Back to you, Nicholas.
Thank you very much, Professor Danang. Maybe I would like to highlight one aspect, especially of your presentation, is till, let's say, 2020, 2021, we were looking at the issues of, I would say, unlocking infrastructure investments to support local development, global growth, etc. And one very important aspect, as was just reminded, was the issue of de-risking investments. And last year, we managed to move very efficiently in that direction, especially through the discussion with the B20 and the D20 by, I would say, comparing the issue of infrastructure investment in general and the advancement of the discussions in the field of energy. And because Indonesia was very much involved, advanced in this just energy transition partnership, and with energy transition mechanism as being the Indonesian way to deal with that, we could see that the issue of de-risking was not mission impossible. But we could also see that we needed a number of key factors to be aligned, from global talks to regional level to national level, and to consideration about the organization of the strategic geography at the national level. One question for us all today and for the rest of the discussion is about de-risking is the conditions, we say the macroeconomic conditions or the macroeconomic coordination has probably not improved since last year with the context of the war in Ukraine, but also all issues linked with the fragmentation of geopolitical decisions and so on and so on and so on. So an even more compelling question for us is how we can still support a global approach to infrastructure investments at the G20 level in a context which is being more fragmented, and how we may also push for greater convergence between G20 and G7. G7 has acknowledged last year the partnership for infrastructure investments with $600 billion, but we don't know exactly what it is about. So these are changing overall conditions that we cannot ignore. Following this, who would like to follow on Danang? Anita, maybe, or yes, Anita? Anita, please go on. Then we will go to Gladys and then to Joyza.
Yeah, many thanks, Nicola. And Pak Danang, of course, you are way ahead of us, understanding the difficulties that are there before the governments, policymakers, and especially as we work in the ASEAN area, and we work with the connectivity plans, the MPAC, very closely. So, which is why there is a sense of urgency in us, in fact, bordering on impatience, that how soon can we get the policy platform or the policy environment right? And now, because we are talking in context of G20, so our immediate concern is how to get the policy environment in the G20 right on the issue of financing of sustainable infrastructure. So from that perspective, I submit to you, Nicola, and to all my other panelists, that why are we discussing this issue repeatedly year after year, especially in the context of G20? Because you see, the COVID setback notwithstanding, multilateral cooperation for fund mobilization has been repeated on every possible forum numerous times. But the scope of this issue is such, it always surprised me as a policy researcher to see how inadequate our research and concrete evidence has been. Has been provided by the multilateral agencies to the policymakers to arrive at a broad form of consensus. Because let's face it, financing sustainable and resilient infrastructure that could converge the need of investors, governments, and people. This is what we are discussing in this particular task force. So this is a difficult triad. I have written about this earlier also, but I have also argued that this is not an impossible task, just as Nicola mentioned that the de-risking issue is difficult but not impossible. So why is this issue important now in this G20 particularly? Well, the facts are not hidden because, I'll bring forward a few points in support of this, but it is important to note here, many of us know this, that the issue of infrastructure financing is being considered in the G20 Infrastructure Working Group. And Nicola, I have read the outcomes of the second IWG held in March. And I'm while I appreciate the theme for infrastructure for financing for urban infrastructure, it still strikes me on the kind of side events and discussions that took place in that working group. Discussing a similar issue, the lack of data and major evidence whereby financing can be made for sustainable infrastructure. So therefore, I look at this year's IWG's outcomes so far, because we have still only seen the 2 meetings, is that they are still caught somewhere in between and they have a lot of ground to cover. So coming from that perspective, I propose 3 major points in this task force I don't know how this can be conveyed into the IWG, but regardless, I still go ahead and make this point. The responsibility before international organization and MDBs is to bring forth reliable data on financing for sustainable infrastructure. And the G20 has given this mandate to MDBs and to agencies like the Global Infrastructure Hub. So that needs to be taken to its logical and useful end. So this is the first major point. I've been repeating this earlier also in our previous discussions. But having made this first and initial point, I need to say this, that issues with infrastructure project pipelines, governance, budget commitments, national government's budget commitments, land uses, sustainability costs. These are all very important factors that inhibit domestic and global capital flows into infrastructure projects. And I would say that this is equally true for international or bilateral financing, which have had a lot of discussions on their integrity and are perhaps in several cases not conducive to people's need. So these issues resurface time and again. Therefore, I submit that multilateral cooperation among governments and development banks can support an environment where policy regulation, markets, and capacity elements, etc., can be brought together to support capital investments and to support integrity and value-based financing. And that's where the G20 has to take a lead in supporting such multilateral cooperation. We know that G20 has come forward with framework and key principles earlier, but this sort of a multilateral cooperation framework is still not seen in the G20 process. And the third point that I want to make is this, and this is not in any manner subservient to the previous 2 points, that sustainable infrastructure is definitely a recognized pathway for narrowing development gaps among regions. It can uplift development indices, quality infrastructure, whether it's for transport or for water, energy. These are all indispensable for the Agenda 2030 and the 17 SDGs. Investing in infrastructure helps integrate our national markets and provides connection to global value chains. I come here from my perspective of an international trade specialist. So infrastructure growth is trade enhancing, development enhancing, enables direct investments into the country. Then what really is the issue here? The issue, as I see it, is that mobilizing funds for sustainable infrastructure, it requires a very predictable and informed and a facilitative environment. And this is where I find the theme of this task force merging with the hardcore issue of infrastructure financing working group and the finance track. And that is why I am very curious and even persuasive, I would say, to find an engagement angle between our work and the infrastructure working group. Because we know that despite several policy guidances provided by the G20, mobilizing funds will always remain a tricky issue. Multilateral cooperation model that is endorsed by G20 can provide this predictable and informed environment that I spoke about just now, which is equally facilitative. In fact, I'm arguing for such a multilateralism in the upcoming volume for this task force group, and to suggest to the G20 to somehow overcome the underlying causes of financing gaps for infrastructure investment in Asia and Africa, and to facilitate global investments. Because I am of the view that the G20 must go beyond frameworks and principles and find an agency for itself into for investment facilitation for infrastructure projects, which can and which will reduce asymmetry of information, simplify governance even, and bring together the regulatory processes, including minimizing risks on return.
Yeah.
So the government's role becomes very important here. And before
Anita?
I end, very quickly, 2 points. These are policy issues. In fact, I would say they are bordering on political also, which are somehow influencing the convergence of developmental needs. One is that financing of infrastructure is creating competition among several countries. They have infrastructure initiatives have become the new geopolitical tools, in fact. But, and this is my final point, governments play a central role in most infrastructure projects because sustainable infrastructure has a strong public goods characteristics and requires large-scale capital mobilization and is very sensitive to the local politics. Therefore, and these are all very longer-term needs, stretching over 10 to 15 to 20 years. So, which is the reason why this enabling environment must come from the governments. We have seen some successful examples in the MPAC, the Master Plan on ASEAN connectivity, the EU-Asia connectivity, which are seeking very great emphasis on governance standards, transparency, and sustainability. In different degrees, of course, but yeah. So I would like to stop here, but and leave the panelists with these 3 important points and 2 influencers, policy influencers, and we'll see if we can come back on this as discussions move forward. Thanks,
Thank you.
Nicola.
Thank you very much. A lot of very strong inputs also by your side, and I think what is very interesting also is the call, and I think Saha is listening carefully because he will have to report also to Sachin about the discussion of today and how to convene the essence of it alongside with that of the policy notes in the main conclusions of the task force and in our recommendations for the T20 communique and towards the G20. But I would agree with you that at this moment the work of the infrastructure working group is very technical, but it's only halfway to meet. Say it's a larger, a broader approach to social needs linked with infrastructure issues, and also complementing what Danang was mentioning, is not the question just at this moment of low growth or sluggish growth forecasts, etc. But clearly infrastructure have become a major geopolitical tool. So one aspect which we cannot really ignore is how we can address that through the G20, which is more about convergence, etc. And this is really an important question, and how we can maybe have a strong say about how to support revamping the Agenda 2030 and address development needs. I was mentioning the G7, but equally, even if the figures are not the same, at BRICS level, right, there are a number of ongoing initiatives linked with the bank, linked with the investments in infrastructure, etc. So I think here that specifically the Indian G20, T20 can have a say, maybe from a societal, also social and societal standpoint. I stop here and I turn to our colleague Gladys Lecchini in Rosario, Argentina, with flu and influenza and early time. But please, for the next 5 minutes, share your views about this discussion about priorities for the T20/G20 regarding resilient infrastructure and investments in infrastructure systems. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Nicholas. I want to thank Professor Chaturvedi for inviting me to join the Task Force 3, and also congratulate Nicholas for his comprehensive updating at the very beginning of this panel. I hope this was recorded so that we could have a reminder of all the gains that has been that the gains and the faults of the evolution of the group. Although I haven't been able to make my presentation in seminar 3 due to some personal continuing health inconvenience, my presentation in this group tried to reconcile ethics with the international financial system, proposing the use of green bonds. Coming from and having only 5 minutes, it could be very difficult for me to make the whole presentation. So I like only to give some ideas. First of all, that coming from IR, we normally see the international system as a Hobbesian scenario, which is confirmed by history and everyday events. And although it could look like swimming against the current, it is clear that the world needs an ethical framework to make a desirable transition from conflicts and war to lasting peace. We need to find appropriate answers for the various challenges we are facing, as Amrita Narlikar mentioned in one of the seminars. We need to think out of the box. We also need the political will to bring change through education and learning to achieve a better environment and a sustainable development promoting ethics in international relations. This is why I think that it's possible to reconcile ethics with the international financial system through a financial tool like the green bonds, and that the G20 has also an opportunity to promote agreements and unify criteria on these issues. We know that climate change is one of the most important challenges facing the international order and humanity as a whole, and that developing states have been the actors that have had the lowest emission in historical terms. We also know that at the conference, at different conferences like Copenhagen, Cancun, and Paris, the developed countries pledged a global collective goal by mobilizing resources to help to cope with this situation. Nevertheless, and despite the rhetoric of leaders, industrialized countries have been far from meeting these goals, and there is a chronic deficit on climate actions. Therefore, there is the need to bridge the financing gap caused by climate change, and a multiplicity of institutions and instruments have been developed in recent years to greening the financial system and the economy in general. New forms of financial strategies and instruments like green bonds have the potential to play a significant role in providing the capital necessary for fighting climate change and construct a bridge between finance and ethics. Green bonds are financial instruments designed to support investment in assets where climate change and environmental issues are key concerns. Nevertheless, like all bonds, green bonds are debt securities generally committing to regular payments over a defined period, represented issuers' liability to pay future interest and repay the principal sum involved. Issuers, and this is interest, include banks, corporations, governments, and municipalities, with many bases for classification that reflect funding aims, responsibility, security, and payment construction. Green bonds allow issuers to assume ownership of the climate actions to be funded, thus overcoming the conditionalities of traditional finance suppliers. Furthermore, green bonds could be seen as a solution to the pro-mitigation bias that has been reported in the climate finance tax so far. Nevertheless, these instruments are far from providing a definite or unquestionable remedy because the process of issuing these instruments is complex, costly, and lengthy. So, what's the role for G20 in this situation? G20 is a multilateral space where it could promote a unified criteria for the labeling of bonds through cooperative approaches. G20 can operate as an enabling framework to generate cooperative proposals to foster national capacity building. The deepening of technical knowledge on green bonds by officials dedicated to the design and implementation of national regulations can constitute an additional chapter in the effort to reconcile ethics with the international financial system. G20 could promote a fair and balanced notion of green bonds in a variety of forums as instruments that allow narrowing the gaps in climate finance. Green bonds can increase resources for climate finance and favor a sense of ownership of climate actions to be financed, escaping the conditionalities and biased targeting of resources provided by developing countries. Green bonds are a manifestation of the efforts directed towards developing new frameworks and instruments in order to finance adaptation and mitigation strategies and the socio-economic transition. In this
Thank you.
sense, in this sense, they can be identified as investment vehicles that mobilize resources beyond profit expectations. Underlying green bonds is a quest for a less unequal, more sustainable world. Well,
Gladys,
yes,
please conclude.
yes, no, I've already finished.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you very
Sorry.
much for this strong, for strongly advocating for green bonds and for making the link with the issue of ethics and values in our task force. I think this is an interesting way to also call upon the G20. At this moment, there are all sorts of bonds, right, which are under consideration. Our Indonesian colleagues would say that that is one part of a wider portfolio of potential ways to address the need to provide finance, but this is definitely one way among other. I think what could be very interesting is to keep this issue of de-risking of investments and the way that we have managed to move forward in this direction last year, but apply it to the very context of now, where the both factors of tensions and fragmentation, including within the G20, make it all the more important to find ways to de-risk investments. And I think the issues remain the same, but the parameters make it all the more compelling and challenging. So, as a final, and I'm looking at the time, Joyza, please share also your views, but in a very condensed way. No need for a formal presentation, as you know. about maybe your experience in the context of the G20/G20, but also maybe, or if it is too early, then forget it. But if there is anything that already emerges while we are in the beginning of May about some tendencies or priorities that could be ones for the G20 of Brazil, especially in the context of infrastructure investments and in light of the discussion that we are holding today. Joysa, the floor is yours.
How much time do I have?
5 minutes.
Okay, so priorities. I'll start with the priorities. In the last 2 days, so firstly, thank you for the opportunity to talk here, to interact with you and learn more about the project, the process of T20 and how it's trying to connect, fill the gaps in the relationship with the G20 and G7 as well. So I was looking yesterday at a recent public consultation for an investment plan under the CIF, the Climate Investment Fund Renewable Energy Integration Program. And this is an example that illustrates priorities in the second stage of CIF, in the CIF Renewable Energy Integration Program. Brazil, Costa Rica, India, Indonesia, and Turkey are priority countries for the next stages. And at this time, countries are preparing their programs, submitting to public consultations and to expert appraisal. And one of the elements is the need to provide support to promote, of course, decarbonization of the economy by accelerating the country's clean and inclusive energy transition, addressing economic, financial, regulatory, and technical barriers that hinder the integration of renewables, and also supporting the development and deployment of appropriate infrastructure, maintaining conditions of quality, reliability, and security of supply. By looking at the CIF, I was looking yesterday at the updated version of CIF's theory of change. And there they state in the inputs category the need to consider system transformation, also from the perspective of gender equality, social inclusion, distributional equity, accountability, and learning from the outset. And I think this connects strongly with the with the title of this conversation today, how to ensure a delivery of resilient, sustainable, and inclusive infrastructure. When we look at lending process, financing process, lenders focus on the capacity of payment, so credit and also project risk. And in project preparation, we have an opportunity to focus on inclusiveness, equity dimension. So my focus here today is on the meaning of bringing equity, inclusion to the table. Why is it important? It is important because this is one of the major ways for us to connect public policies, yes, with investors and investments that are going to fuel or to deliver infrastructure that is focusing on the needs of people, the needs of not only people in general, but the needs of low-income people or people that has been more impacted by events such as weather extremes, such as pandemics. And in our study, we often we identify numbers that evidentiate that, for example, a lot of the poorest, and so people in poorest communities, in poorest regions of the country, and this is not limited to our country, are bearing higher costs to finance, not only to finance, but also to pay to cover for infrastructure. So poorly informed pricing and rate design in infrastructure is leading to exclusion and hardship of households. So vulnerable groups are often excluded from social protection programs. But not only that, we also have lower income groups that are not considered vulnerable and that are prone to hardship and limiting consumption due to high rates, meaning high water rates, high electricity rates. Evidence like this is critical to inform policy making and investments in infrastructure in the global south. The experience of several network industries illustrate this affordability challenge. Let me talk, for example, about the example of the electricity industry in Brazil. The country managed to connect more than 99.8% of the population to the grid, providing electricity services through one of the cleanest power generation mixes. However, the electricity sector certainly needs help to balance the user's ability to pay and tariffs that allow efficient cost recovery and investors' return. So the question posed to us is how can we deliver affordability and tackle hardship in utility services? This is important for us to bring content to the concept of inclusiveness that is in the core of our mission here: resilient, sustainable, and inclusive infrastructure. So, I would just finish by saying that we need to bring evidence to the table. We need to be able to map people's ability and capacity to pay to the design preparation stage in infrastructure projects. And this is something that has already been done in OECD countries. For example, we have the experience for research and evidence towards energy poverty in the EU. This is something that we already discussed last year in the T20 task force in Indonesia. At the time, this discussion was not exactly ripe, but I think in our road to T20 Brazil, we have an opportunity to try to bring evidence to the table on the meaning of inclusiveness to be factored in to the design preparation project so that we can deliver not only resilient and sustainable, but also inclusive infrastructure.
Thank you very much. Very useful and very complementary also to the insights so far. So, any comments from the other members of the task force or the participants to the session? Let me also just recap the exact the titles of the speakers today. Professor Dana was the lead co-chair of the task force infrastructure last year in the T20 Indonesia, and used to be the head of the Toll Road Agency of Indonesia. Is professor at University Gadjah Mada and chairperson of the International Forum of the Rural Transport and Development. Professor Gladys Lekini is professor of international relations at the National University of Rosario in Argentina. Anita Prakash is a senior policy advisor at the area think tank, which is based in Jakarta in Indonesia. And Joyza Dutra is director of the Infrastructure Regulation Center at Fundación Getulio Vargas in Brazil, among other things. Please, any note, any remark? We have been talking about a lot of wide range of topics, but we can see that whatever we try to address, the issue of tackling poverty, addressing inclusion from the, I would say, from the design stage, as was mentioned by Josa Dutra minutes ago, connecting with the ethics and values. They have always came back in our discussion. So I think that might be also an interesting indication also for us about how to proceed with further advocacy regarding the issue of infrastructure investments a little bit in a different way, not repeating what has been already said and repeated over the past few years. So I see our colleague Debolina Kundu. Any other remarks that we could take? Okay, then why don't we start with you, Debolina? The floor is yours.
Thank you.
But please
Thank
be
you.
brief. We have 10 minutes
Yes.
left.
Thank you for the excellent presentations. I had one question in mind, that in addition to getting the global finance, I think countries like India also need to enhance the local financing. If we compare India's taxation, the local taxation system with other countries, I think we are still less than 1% of GDP as compared to 5% to 8% for countries at the similar levels of economic development. So I think that could also be focused as one of the policy prescriptions for enhancing the domestic capital for resilient infrastructure. I stop here. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Yeah, that's indeed a very good point. Any other notes, Ashish Kumar or Chong Hong Jung or anyone else? Not really. Professor James? Really? Then maybe from you, Dr. Sabaya Sashi.
Thank you, Nicholas, for excellently leading us in this discussion. I was intently, hearing to all the speakers, but definitely in the context of G20 and the work of our task force, some of the messages that have emerged as to how we convey some of the, as you rightly said, that who benefits from the finance, the real beneficiaries, the perspectives, and how to bring in more equity in the process of finance. So we need to, convey some of the outcomes of our discussion to the policymakers at various levels. Of course, there are people who are deliberating on the nature of the development model itself, and then you see why the contestations on the infrastructure projects come in, and then of course people who are discussing finance, people who are discussing sustainable finance, and people who are discussing finance for infrastructure in particular. But behind the technical templates that we are struggling with, as Anita ji just mentioned, that data is again a major challenge when we try to see the flows that may be required. But how to build these bridges, and as we had rightly discussed very much at the initial days of the task force deliberations, that how to reach out to wider stakeholders in policy as well as with academic colleagues in different parts, so that the momentum can be built on the real issues. It's certainly has been recognized by all, perhaps, that the normative framework for the policy template is very much important, and within the ethical perspective, the values perspective, how do we see equity coming in and reaching the furthest first, as has been prioritized by the SDGs of leaving no one behind, which is very much a reality and should be brought in as part of a strong recommendation that emerges, because this is a task force where we have the three streams coming together, perhaps on the larger development model and the perspectives that takes us on the development measurement frameworks, and we have colleagues who have contributed on the possibilities of integrating ethics and values as part of the financing processes, and of course the technocratic perspective on how the template should look like. So definitely we can brainstorm a little more as we meet in Mumbai next week as to how to summarize the key points that have been discussed so far. Thank you once again. And I see Professor Danang has points from his end. Yeah, over to you, Professor Danang. Yeah.
Can I respond to the earlier discussions, Nicola?
Yes, please, absolutely.
Yes, I think I enjoy the conversation and the discussion and presentation from all the panelists. I think that the discussion about the need for incorporating the climate issues, ensuring that we have a balanced perspective on gender. And this year we are also having the demand, very strong demand to include ethics and values to be put in all the development agenda. But I think from the economic perspective, it becoming more and more complex issues that with the complexity comes the price for that and the risk for incorporating all the aspects into development policy decisions. I think the word de-risking has comes over and over again. The more that complexity comes in, more risk associated with that. And I think the question today is that who is going to pay for that risk to be mitigated or to be eliminated? I think it's why I think it's a time to even more giving more pressures either to multilateral development banks or bilateral banks or bilateral funding agencies to step in to reduce those risks. Um, I agree on all of the risks that is associated with the project. I think we have to put that in practice and put on the more pragmatic scale on how to actually address that kind of risk associated with the projects. It's why I think when the examples of green bonds for issuance, for example, which is more acceptable internationally, but is not acceptable domestically because the transaction cost is so high. This is one of the examples. And also last year, Indonesia government, the Ministry of Finance, she is asking for international support when it comes to energy transition, when it comes to early retiring the coal power plants earlier than it should be as promised in the concession agreement. Somebody has to step in to make sure that it's not only domestic efforts but also international efforts. So I think come back to my earlier arguments that uh, when it comes to the initiative of investments and sustainable investment and financing, I think international collaboration is a must, and I think we have to try to have a better formulation of how international agencies, countries are involved in that effort.
Okay,
Back
yes.
to you, Nabil.
I think this could be the final wise words for the discussion of today. I very much concur to what you just mentioned, Professor Danang. For each and every one of us, I put in the chat the reference to the communique of the T7 Japan, which was released just last week, and which has one of its main direction consists in trying to bridge the G7 and the G20. And we have been working very closely with the T20 India in shaping that communique. And it includes a number of references to infrastructure investments in line with our discussion of today, but also introducing another, I would say, angle of infrastructure investments, which is often forgotten, which is about research infrastructure. So it's a little bit of a different, maybe a niche, but quite important regarding the number of topics such as surveying, climate transformations, etc. So please have a look to this document, because it was also agreed last week together with the chair of the task force, Dr. Sachin, and the other chair of the task force and of the T20 India, Ambassador Chinoy, that at some point, probably after the G20 summit, T20 India and T7 Japan would issue at least one joint communique, right? So in this regard, we can also continue deepen the discussion and the expertise that we may want to share, especially about de-risking investments and taking into account the transaction costs, which is something that is extremely important. With that, we have reached the end of our conversation of today. I wish to thank very much all the organizing team at the T20 India for the perfect organization. As usual, you must be a bit relieved because this was the last of our seminars, but you must not be so relieved because the T20 Intermediate Summit is coming up soon, and then there will be the communique and so on and so on and so on. So there is still a lot of your table and our common table. And I think our discussion of today has really made a strong point. There is a comment in the chat from Dr. Goiri Sankar Nag to everyone, which I would also like to thank for and to share, because we need very much to strengthen the way and strengthen our message regarding how to include these aspects of our discussion about ethics and values into infrastructure investment systems, but also build upon the strong findings from last year, especially last year. And Professor Danang was mentioning his open remarks about sustainable infrastructure investment framework and other, I'd say, concrete proposals that emerged from the T20, G20 Indonesia, plus also the absolute need, I would say, to speak to others, so that the T20 is at the crossroads of the discussion, the blue sky or forward-thinking discussions about infrastructure investments and systems, but also the very technical discussions that are taking place at this moment, not just within the engagement groups, but also within the finance track. With this, I think we can reach, I would say, comprehensive recommendations this year also, and ahead of the G20, T20 Brazil next year. So if there is no other remark, I suggest to stick to the time.
We would have a vote of thanks by Saeed Arsalan.
Please,
yes,
please, absolutely. Vote of thanks is
Thank you.
mandatory. So
yes.
Sorry about that. Thank you for
Sure.
reminding me. Saeed, the floor is yours, and then we wrap it up.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So friends and colleagues, with this wonderful session, we have come to the close of the most engaging seminar series. As always, I would like to begin by thanking the session chair, Mr. Nicolas Rochud, for chairing this session. Next, I would like to thank the speakers in today's seminar, Professor Gladys, Professor Danang, Ms. Anita Prakash, and our guest speaker, George Sidustra, for the informative and insightful presentation on financing sustainable and resilient and inclusive infrastructure. I thank the co-chairs for the participation in the discussions, making for an energetic and stimulating session overall. My thanks goes out to all those in attendance. As ever, your questions and active involvement in the seminar really helped explore the full scope of today's session. As curtains fall on this seminar series, we can rest assured that the idea discussed herein will be carried forward with us in thought, spirit, and action. That being said, let us take a brief look back at the various themes put up for the discussion throughout the series. The inaugural session of the seminar series brought up the topic of well-being measurement approaches and recalibrating international institutions, laying the groundwork for a well-grounded discussions on the themes at hand. The second session dealt with the sustainable consumption and production, climate crisis, and One Health. The third session raised the matter of infusing ethics and integrity in international relations. The fourth session talked about mainstreaming community partnerships and traditional approaches to lifestyle for environment. The penultimate session engaged the urban-rural linkages for a new development model. And of course, today's final session on financing sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure ended the series on a very strong note. The outcome of the series owes itself to the dedication of the chairs, co-chairs and speakers, and most of all, the regular and involved participation of the attendees who joined us in an impressive numbers weeks after weeks. I would like to extend my gratitude to all those involved in making this series a success. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. The recording would be available on our YouTube channel, and the whole series has now been recorded and uploaded on our YouTube channel, which will make up for a real good repository of the ideas that we have come up with in the last couple of weeks. And definitely, we are also going to bring out comprehensive notes from this seminar series at the end, which can be a ready kind of reference for everyone. Yeah, thank you so much.
Before
Thank
you
you.
disconnect,
Thank you very
Dr.
much.
Saha, I
You know,
had a question
Professor,
regarding that
huh,
side event.
yeah,
I haven't got any response.
yes, ma'am, we have taken note of your email and have forwarded, and we would act on it. Surely it would be done. Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah, actually, even I tried to write, I didn't get any response, Dr. Saha.
So
Bye.
noted, we will convey to the
Okay.
secretariat.
Thank
and
you
see
so
how
much.
to-
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
yeah.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Dr. Ruby, I would like to request you if you can participate. Can you listen?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I have proposed a side event on Ayurveda, the
Uh-huh.
holistic science of well-being for the world. So I wanted you to participate if possible. It is
When is
proposed
this?
for July 15 to
Sure.
17.
15 to 17. Let me look at my calendar.
I will
if I
write
can,
to you. I will
yes,
write to you.
please,
Yeah.
please. Please.
Okay.
And what will I do is, in case I can't do in person, I will definitely do virtually.
Thank
One
you
of the
so
two.
much.
Okay. Well,
Thank
sure,
you.
sure. Absolutely.
Your mail must be here in the mailbox, I
Yeah.
suppose.
I mean, Dr. Saha also has
Yes,
sites.
Okay.
we'll just share with you. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Hello. Namaste, Professor Chaturvedi. Ji, I'm fine, just in time. Where are you? You didn't join today and the last time in our presentation also.